Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Isaac, and welcome to Isaac and Friends. So, today I'm going to talk about something that is a little near and dear to my own heart, Egyptology. Now, I have spent pretty much my entire childhood reading practically every documentary book and every documentary that I could watch, everything, all of that. And today, the reason why this is being sparked is because I read an article that just made me have to just stop and question my faith in any kind of Western academics, especially in terms of Egyptology and archaeology. And so, what's going on is apparently from the Manchester Museum curators, there is this new theory that they're trying to profligate and say that the Egyptian pharaohs were, and mummies in general from Egypt were not made as a means of preserving the body. It was a happy circumstance kind of thing. Now, before we really dig into this, let's kind of go over what the accepted ideology of what's going on here. So, for those of you not in the know, the ancient Egyptians, at the very core of their religious belief, is the story of Isis and Osiris. In that story, Osiris is brutally murdered by his brother Set, who then, either depending on what version you have, either scattered his parts down the Nile or across Egypt. In general, the idea is that Osiris was murdered and thrown to bits. Isis, being a dutiful and loving sister slash wife to Osiris, then gathers his parts and puts him back together through clay with bandages, all sorts of things, to kind of bring him back to life, and does so. And so the first mummy is born. And thus comes the reason this for mummification as a attempt to kind of copy what happened in the myth, the idea of creating a way of reincarnation or a way of rebirth from death. Now, apparently, as part of this theory, this person, this curator, who should definitely know better, being a curator surrounded by numerous objects in the Manchester Museum, most of which are very dubiously acquired. Let's be honest, the the Egyptian Antiquities Bureau has been trying to get their crap back from the age of British basically coming, lords basically coming in and saying, well, I funded the archaeological expedition, therefore I own everything they dig up, even though that's not true at all. In fact, even back then, um, Egyptian authorities were kind of a little pissed at that, but because, hey, this was a bigger country and we hadn't grown up as a humanity yet, they basically kept a hold of them instead. But basically, now I will digress and I will say, okay, this theory of theirs, and so the full extent of the theory is that the pharaohs were actually mummified to become some kind of macabre statue and for religious significance and reverence. Now, this might hold some weight if it weren't for quite a number of things. One, the biggest, most glaring problem is that the pharaohs were not the only ones to be mummified. Practically anyone who could afford it was mummified, pardon me for the burp, including your royal hairdresser got mummified and was buried in big tombs. You had people that were essentially commoners that just happened to be able to afford it, especially in later eras, being able to be mummified. You have animals being ritually mummified on a regular. So it's very clear, not only from that, but from the frescoes and the hieroglyphics in these tombs, that it is very much set forward that the whole point of this is to preserve the body, and in fact to make sure that the body is recognizable to the soul. In fact, this is even compounded by even further archaeological evidence. For example, I believe Dr. Zahi Hawass was actually digging into the ruins of a necropolis for a temple of Thoth, and they found literally wax heads that had been carefully crafted and made specifically in case the body had decayed or had been damaged in any way, so that the spirit could recognize the dance of the particular high priest. So there is a lot of evidence showing that yes, preservation of the body was pretty high up on their list of things that they wanted to make sure happened. Now, there is quite a bit more to it as well. You can look at the grave goods that these mummies were buried with. Every single mummy, even, how should I say, commoner mummies, were still buried with various goods that they were thought to have required in the afterlife, including food, clothing, furniture. Another major thing that they were buried with were Shabti, which, for those of you who don't know, Shabti is a little clay doll, which the very word Shabti means to answer. Because the idea was in the afterlife, the rich hated the idea of working so much they made little clay servants that would do all the work for them, even in the afterlife. So, which again is still again a bit more damning. But then we have to also look at not just the burial practices, but let's also look at the religious practices of ancient Egyptians and how they treated things that were intended to be a thing of worship, a thing of reverence. Now, in comparison to how, of course, the mummies of the pharaohs were treated, for the most part, in ancient Egyptian religion, they had very large, very public temple complexes. So statues meant for worship, for reverence, were placed in public areas, essentially. Big public places that these things were the centerpiece for. And even if you couldn't go into the inner chamber, you could still see the statue as it's being tended to by the priests. Which is a very stark contrast to how the pharaoh's mummies were treated. These mummies were not put in a public display. They were not set up for people to come and worship and revere. And let's say, well, what about temples that were supposed to be mock tombs? Again, there's another bit of to play there. Temples that were meant to be like mock tombs for the god Osiris had a cornucopia of offerings that have been given throughout the thousands of years. For example, in southern Egypt on the west side, there's a particular little region that's especially associated with Osiris. And that area is so caked and covered with just nothing but offering plates and vases and artifacts that even ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR cannot see through just the sheer amount of clay pots. Because it was active for freaking 10,000 years. 10,000 years worth of clay pots and offerings will do that. But, back to the topic. Essentially, looking at how Egyptians treated their sacred objects compared to how the mummies of the pharaohs were treated. Because the pharaohs when they were buried, they were sealed off. You were not allowed to go into the tombs. If you went into the tomb, if you took anything out of the tomb especially, you would be put to death instantly. If they found out about it, that was a sure way to get executed. So that's quite a bit of a difference from something that's supposed to have religious significance, especially for a culture that, when something has religious significance, is very prone to display it. That's very prone to making showy displays, of having grand festivals where these statues are essentially brought out and they're shown to the entire populace. And the people are welcome to come in, and they're welcome to give offerings to these statues. And they're welcome to participate in these kind of festivals. And in fact, there are some festivals that were participated by the pharaohs annually, where it would require that these things be brought out. And we can see something similar now. For example, if these mummies were meant to have a religious significance and not merely for the preservation of the body, you would expect to see something like what the Inca did. And what the Inca did is they would preserve the body, of course, and they would wrap it up and basically protect it. And then they would have it set up where the mummy could be taken out of its holding area, out of where it's being taken care of, it's being preserved, and then paraded through town, which is where they get, the Saints Parade Day from, surprisingly enough. Yeah, that's actually a more Christianized version of an ancient Incan ritual of basically taking their ancestors and parading them around town as a means of celebrating the dead and celebrating with them. We don't see any evidence of that in ancient Egypt. It's very clear that once these mummies were interred into their tombs, that's where they freaking stayed. Unless they were robbed, or you had grave robbers come in and basically desecrate the tombs and destroy them. And again, that was heavily frowned upon by the ancient Egyptians. Now, of course, one of the evidences that this curator tries to bring up is, well, certain mummies weren't as well preserved. Like Tut's mummy was stuck to the bottom of his coffin. First off, when it comes to Tut's mummy in particular, don't let the jewelry and don't let all the glitz and glam fool you. Tutankhamun did not live in a glorious time of Egypt. He lived in a very tumultuous time of Egypt, politically, religiously. His father, Akhenaten, literally just tried to wipe out all the old religions and was considered the heretic pharaoh, to the point that his city, Amarna, which he purposely founded to worship his god, was razed to the ground where not a single brick was left. That should tell you how much they hated this man. And his son was now the pharaoh. After his mother, Nefertiti, had to act as a steward to the throne until he was old enough, which she faced enough of her own problems from being the wife of Akhenaten. And I will say that some people, to go off topic here, some people will say, well, the Egyptians just didn't like female rulers. Correction. The Egyptians didn't like two female rulers that we know of very specifically because of a few things. Nefertiti, mainly because she was exceptionally in depth with her husband in the eradication of the old ways and religions, to the point of assisting and even acting as his high priestess, which you can imagine doesn't sit too well with a bunch of people that, as that happens, all of a sudden all the food is gone. The funny thing that about ancient people and religions is that when the king decides to entertain a new religion and suddenly all the food is gone, the river dries up, and there is a whole lot of military and social unrest, yeah, people tend to not take too kindly to that. Uh, and Hatshepsut's biggest problem was that she was essentially seen as a usurper for the throne because she was supposed to cede the throne to her young son because he was the male heir, and of course the male heir is supposed to take over the throne as pharaoh. Enter the actual first female pharaoh ever. Her name is Sobek Nefru, or, to translate for those of you who don't understand what that means, the beauty of Sobek. And she was not only so well supported and beloved that her entire dynasty straight up took her name as their name throughout the entire dynasty. She was heavily revered by the ancient Egyptian people and loved. Back to topic. Sorry, I'm ADHD. That happens. Back to topic. So, again, looking at Tut's mummy. Well, looking at the political situation, the reason why Tut isn't as well as preserved as he should be is A, his successor, Pharaoh I, because of the political turmoil, Pharaoh I was not supposed to actually be the one to take over the throne. But the actual guy that was supposed to succeed Tutankhamun wasn't in Egypt at the time. He was fighting Semitic peoples up north. And so Pharaoh I tried to do everything he could to rush the mummification as fast as he possibly could. Because in order to secure legitimacy over the throne, he had to be the one to bury the pharaoh. So he had to rush that job. Some of the other pharaohs, for example, like the original unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt, known as the Scorpion King, there's a little reason why his mummy's not that well preserved. One, not only is he probably one of the first pharaohs of a true unified Egypt, but there is also a bigger problem. See, this same pharaoh, the reason why his mummy is not so well preserved has a lot more to do with the fact that before he could truly fully reintegrate both Lower and Upper Egypt together, he was captured by the Hyksos, which are Semitic invaders at the time, and then brutally executed with multiple axe wounds to the face. I don't care how good of a mummification expert you are. There's not much you can do when the pharaoh's face has been literally cut to pieces and smashed to pieces. There's not a whole lot you can do with that. Just saying. So there are better reasons as to why those mummies weren't as better prepared. Because when you're looking at something like this, if anything, if you're going to make any kind of theory in regards to an ancient culture as why they did something, you really have to look at the bigger picture. You have to look at everything that's going on, not just a small segment of it. And while we're so usually fascinated with the pharaohs, we have to understand that, again, the whole entirety of Egypt practiced mummification if they could afford it, if they had the means and the power and the authority to afford it. And that did include, like I said, anyone from the noble head, from the royal hairdresser to your average clerk. So, if this was about religious relevance or religious significance, and having the pharaoh being made a deity in death, rather than preserving his body so that his soul could move on and continue to do its job in death, why would all of these other people get mummified? Wouldn't that be sacrilegious? Wouldn't that, in fact, be a form of blasphemy? Honestly, that's, if you're going to talk about something like that, yes, that would be exactly what that is. To have a commoner treated as though they are a pharaoh would be considered blasphemy if it was about religious significance. And again, like I said, when something was religious significance, especially a statue, unless it was specifically used for an offering, or it was a burial statue intended to be a gift for the dead, as something with religious significance, it would most certainly have been displayed publicly. It would most certainly have been placed where people could give offerings to it, especially considering that the pharaohs had dedicated mortuary temples. And for those of you who don't know what that is, I'll explain. A mortuary temple is a temple that a pharaoh would purposely build to be a place where their cult could gather after their death and worship the pharaoh as a god. Now, I don't know about you, but I would say it would be very clear that if you want to worship the pharaoh as a god, and you have a cult, and he has a mortuary temple, would it not be wiser in that case, if it was supposed to be for religious significance, than to have the pharaoh's statuesque body not in a hole in the ground or underneath a giant pyramid, but in the center of the temple complex itself, where that statue, air quotes, could be properly tended, where the oils could continue to be placed upon the body, where the wrappings could be changed out and the body could be continuously worked on and prevented from decaying. Which, that's exactly what would happen if that was the case. Now, obviously, from all the other artifacts that we have, it would be very difficult to honestly accept such nonsense. Because, let's be fair, considered all things, that there's only one way I could really describe it as being is nonsense. Now, supposedly the reason why this curator decided that they wanted to have a kind of a second look at this was because, well, surely it was the reason why this had to be the thing they came up with was because it was the 1920s and people were obsessed with the afterlife, and and I shit you not, in the end of the article he talks about, well, plus we need to question everything because all of this was brought by cisgendered white males. First off, I'm gonna just put it out here straightforward to the point. What is or isn't in someone's pants, or what their gender identity is, should mean bugger all to the authenticity of their research. Okay? If you're going to question something like that, you need to have significant evidence. And there should be a little thing called peer review. Now, unfortunately, in Western academia, peer review is kind of a joke, especially when you can convince scientific peers that something is the next greatest piece of feminist writing ever by literally taking Mein Kampf as written by Hitler and switching around a few pronouns. Something that honest peer review should have noticed immediately, as it should have been very evident as to what is Mein Kampf and what is someone's own individual work, among other things. But I think that's enough of me ranting today. I hope I wasn't too incoherent. Thank you for watching, everybody, and I hope you guys enjoy this video. Stay safe, my friends. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below. And let me know if you want to see more content like this, preferably more coherent with the script. I'd be happy to do that for you guys. So thanks for watching again, and take care.